Celebration was the first thing Albus Dumbledore distrusted. Before midnight, the owls had begun. By midnight, the first rockets were bursting over village greens and town squares, exploding in violet and gold above rooflines still blacked against the war. By 1 in the morning, witches were embracing strangers in alleys. Wizards were buying rounds for one another in every pub that kept a back room for the magical trade. Voldemort was gone. The word passed from mouth to mouth, with all the reckless gratitude of a people who did not dare examine their own good fortune too closely, in case it vanished on inspection. Dumbledore heard the noise from the high windows of the headmaster's office, and felt no peace in it. Fawkes, wakeful on his perch, turned one golden eye toward him as another cheer rose from the grounds far below, where a knot of seventh years had plainly convinced themselves that curfew had not been written for historic evenings. Silver instruments on the spindle-legged tables rotated and hummed with their usual expensive discretion. Nothing in the room acknowledged that the shape of the world had altered. That wash, Dumbledore thought, was one of the castle's better qualities. Great old places had very little patience for human declarations of finality. They had outlived too many. He had seen the wreck at Godric's Hollow by then. Not thoroughly. Not in the manner he intended to revisit it later, with quiet and instruments and the solitude required by dangerous thought. But enough. Enough to know that Lily Potter had died between the curse and her son. Enough to know that James Potter had fallen before he could reach them. Enough to know that Harry still breathed. And enough, above all, to feel in the broken nursery the obscene recoil of a magic that had not behaved as any simple duel or murder ought to behave. A dead, dark wizard leaves behind many things. Fear, opportunists, half-finished orders, followers suddenly pious, public men eager to rename survival as policy. Yet if the dark wizard is truly dead, he also leaves a shape of conclusion. The place where he ended bears it. The air closes around the fact. Godric's Hollow had not closed. It had torn. Minerva McGonagall met him on Privet Drive with a face sharpened by fatigue and disapproval. She had been waiting in the form of a tabby cat for hours, watching number 4 with the severe patience of one who expects civilization to improve under observation and is repeatedly disappointed. The Dursleys, she informed him at once, were narrow, graceless, noisy, and inadequate to any noble purpose. She did not bother to moderate the report in deference to their muggle status. Petunia's shrillness, Vernon's smug animal self-satisfaction, the boy Dudley's practiced tyranny over toys and garden furniture alike, none of it recommended them. Dumbledore listened, because Minerva's dislikes were rarely unserious, and because each minute he delayed increased the chance that his own resolve might soften into something less useful. Harry must have his mother's blood about him, he said when she had finished. Protection can be made from that. Minerva's mouth thinned. Protection is not the same as kindness. No, Dumbledore said, and because it was the truest word available to him just then, it remained standing between them longer than either wished. Hagrid arrived out of darkness with the child asleep against a blanket too large for him, the motorcycle coughing and sputtering indignantly before falling silent. The giant's beard was wet. Whether from mist or tears, Dumbledore did not inquire. Hagrid had loved James and Lily in the simple, wholehearted fashion that makes grief look almost innocent. He surrendered Harry reluctantly, as men surrender relics they have been trusted to bear through battle. The boy was warm. That was Dumbledore's first sensation. Warm and startlingly light, a small weight of bone and breath and exhausted infancy in the crook of his arm. Harry did not wake when he was transferred. His head turned a little, cheek against the blanket, hand curling once as if to hold a dream in place. There was a cut upon the brow shaped with unnatural neatness into a slash. Dumbledore touched no magic to it. He scarcely needed to. Something in the wound answered his proximity with a faint, wrong vibration, as though a seam had been made where no seam should exist. He stilled. Minerva, standing close in the dark, mistook the pause for pity. "Poor little thing," she whispered. Yes, Dumbledore thought, but pity was too small a word for the burden gathering around the child already. He carried Harry to the doorstep himself. The street lay in that suburban stillness which is not peace, but ignorance. Clipped hedges, sealed curtains, the low snore of ordinary domesticity keeping itself convinced the world is properly arranged. A cat moved along a garden wall. Somewhere farther down the road a milk float rattled faintly. Number 4 sat among its neighbors with all the complacent ugliness of a house, certain its habits were virtues. He placed the letter upon the blankets. He arranged the child with more care than any sleeping infant could appreciate. Then he remained there, one hand resting lightly against the wicker of the basket, while behind him, Minerva and Hagrid waited with the tactful helplessness of those who know a decision has already been made and pity the person required to enact it. The truth he did not give them was simple enough. Harry would be safer here than elsewhere. Safer in blood wards than in sentiment. Safer with people who would resent him than with any household eager to adore the boy who lived. Dumbledore could justify every piece of it. He had in fact been justifying it to himself since Hagrid's first message. Yet justification has a dry sound in the soul when laid beside a baby's sleeping breath. He thought of Tom Riddle then, unwillingly and at once. Not the man with the serpent's face and the voice like a knife drawn over stone. The boy, dark-haired, watchful, already measuring rooms by what could be taken from them. Dumbledore had been younger when he first climbed the steps of Wool's orphanage and met that child in a sunless room full of stolen trophies. He had recognized danger. He had not yet understood its depth. Some failures reveal themselves only years later, and by then they have often learned to call themselves history. Harry sighed in his sleep. Dumbledore withdrew his hand. "There," he said, because some ceremony had to conclude the thing. "Good luck, Harry." Hagrid made a sound too rough to be speech. Minerva turned her face away under the pretense of adjusting her spectacles. Dumbledore stepped back from the doorstep, the street lamp laying a thin amber line along the silver of his beard, and raised the deluminator. With each soft click, another pool of light folded inward and vanished. Darkness settled over Privet Drive like a lid. They parted. Yet Dumbledore did not return at once to Hogwarts. Instead, he walked the length of Magnolia Crescent, through a park damp with night mist, and only when he had placed several Muggle streets between himself and the house did he allow himself to stop beneath a chestnut tree and think. Thought had become dangerous company in recent years, but it was the only company honest enough to keep now. Voldemort was gone. The words remained plausible, but not sufficient. There had been no body, only violence. No true magical echo of a life ended, only rupture. Followers had not all fled in the simple manner of men, suddenly masterless. Some had panicked. Some had hidden. Some, too composed by half, had begun laying plausible stories at once. Lucius Malfoy among them undoubtedly. Men like Malfoy did not survive by loyalty, but by their gift for arriving early at the next truth and claiming they had always held it. And beneath all of that political debris lay the more private problem of Tom himself. Tom, who had feared death before he had a proper beard. Tom, who as a schoolboy had asked certain questions too deftly and collected certain trophies too lovingly. Tom, who had never wanted merely to win. He had wanted exemption. He had wanted the world to admit that its rules applied to everyone else. Dumbledore lifted his head. Far away, beyond the Muggle dark, another rocket bloomed and died. If Tom Riddle had left some preparation behind him, and Dumbledore no longer trusted himself to doubt it, then celebration would be the most dangerous hour of all. Nations are most vulnerable not when they fear the enemy, but when they decide the enemy has become a story already. By the time he returned to the castle, the eastern sky was paling. The feast halls were empty. Fireworks residue drifted like exhausted dust over the grounds. In the headmaster's office he did not sit, though the chair looked suddenly older than it had the night before. He went instead to the cabinet where certain private records were kept and withdrew a slim folio bearing the name Riddle, Tom Marvolo. The castle had begun to wake around him. House elves lit kitchen fires below. A portrait 2 corridors away coughed itself into the day. Fox rustled scarlet wings on the perch. Dumbledore opened the folio. If the wizarding world wanted its dawn, it might have it. He would not begrudge them a few hours of relief. But while Britain celebrated the end of one war, he would begin the quieter, dirtier work of discovering whether the defeated boy he had once known had left any part of himself behind to wage another. He had the strong suspicion that he had just placed an infant on a doorstep and a puzzle in his own hands, and that the two were bound together in ways the night had not yet finished revealing. At first light, he returned to Godric's Hollow alone. The village still wore the face of a place that had woken into rumor before fact. Curtains twitched. Doors opened and shut. People spoke in low, stunned voices over garden walls. Among Muggles, the damage was already translating itself into language they could bear. A gas explosion, perhaps, or some strange electrical accident. Wizards, arriving in little knots and trying not to be seen, were expressions that mingled awe, superstition, and a greed for proximity to history that Dumbledore had always found distasteful. Triumph, even second-hand triumph, brings scavengers with it. He made the lane impassable to all but himself, and stepped through the splintered frame of the cottage. Houses remember. Not as portraits remember, nor as ghosts do, but in a dull, faithful way woven out of temperature and grain, and the chemistry of repeated days. This house remembered laughter enough to make the ruin cruel. A saucepan lay dented in the kitchen as if dropped mid-task. A family photograph had blown under a chair and lodged there half-burnt, James' shoulder and Lily's hair still visible beneath soot. On the stair, a child's knitted sock rested in ash, intact only because absurdity is one of destruction's favored ornaments. Upstairs in the nursery, the air had not settled. Dumbledore closed the door behind him and stood without casting so much as a lumos. Daylight entered through the rent in the wall and through what remained of the window, pale and directionless in the dust. Harry's cot had been overturned and righted again by rescue. One side was blackened. The wallpaper, once cheerful, had peeled inward in long curls like singed skin. Yet the damage itself was not what held him. He raised his wand. The spell he used was delicate enough to read old magic without exciting what remained of it. Blue threads spilled from the tip in a slow revolving pattern, spreading through the room and then drawing tight. Most places where a killing curse has struck retain a hard emptiness, a blunt absence where life has been cut away. Here the threads recoiled from one point near the cot, not into nothing but into a knotted turbulence, as if the spell had brushed against a wound in the air through which something had once been dragged violently and incompletely. Dumbledore watched the blue filaments twist black, then fade. Incomplete. The house offered other evidence if one cared to read it. Lily's sacrifice shone everywhere still, not visible to eyes but tangible to trained perception. A golden residue threaded through the broken room, like sunlight held in cobwebs. That magic had protected Harry. Of that he had no doubt. But protection did not fully explain the blast. Lily's choice had made a shield. It had not made a disappearance. Something in Tom had burst, yes, but something else had done what all creatures do when suddenly torn. It had sought continuance. Dumbledore lowered his wand and, after a long moment, went to the window. The lane below lay hushed. Two villagers were speaking to a uniformed Muggle policeman at the gate. A witch in a plum hat pretended to study the flowers in the neighboring garden while plainly dying to tell everyone she knew what she had seen. History had already begun hardening into anecdote. He turned from the window and began methodically to search. Not for a body. He did not expect one. Not for traces of accomplices. There were none. What he wanted was pattern. Tom Riddle had never been creative in the manner of true artists. He had been inventive, certainly, and often brilliant, but the root of him was repetition. He returned to symbols that confirmed his private legend. He chose objects not simply for use, but for meaning. He arranged terror theatrically. If some act of preservation had been attempted before this night, then somewhere in the magic of the room might remain an echo shaped like its maker. He found no single answer. Instead, he found an accumulation of negations that became almost as persuasive. No sign of ordinary defensive counterspell from Tom against rebound. No sacrificial bond taken into himself and inverted. No possession transfer of the sort some dark practitioners had attempted with beasts or human hosts. And yet still that ragged absence, that sense of a thing wrenched loose but not ended. By noon he was back at Hogwarts with notes enough to trouble any prudent man and satisfy no rational one. The Ministry, receiving what reports it could from a night of arrests and confessions, pressed him for conclusions. Was Voldemort truly dead? Were the Potters the site of final defeat? Could the public be reassured? Dumbledore gave answers as narrow as needles. The Dark Lord had fallen. Harry Potter had survived. The immediate threat was broken. On any point requiring metaphysical confidence, he became vague to the point of insult. Cornelius Fudge, not yet minister but already displaying the eager subservience of those who sense future office, found this tiresome. Barty Crouch found it obstructive. Dumbledore accepted both judgments with serenity. He did not share his deeper unease, even with the Order. Not yet. There are suspicions that become more dangerous merely by being spoken too soon. A half-formed theory in frightened company can do more damage than ignorance. Instead, he began with what he knew. Tom Riddle had feared death as other boys feared darkness, not because he had seen it closely, but because he resented anything existing beyond his command. Even as a student, he had shown a marked aversion to mortality and abstract discussion. The great wars of the previous generation, which had sobered many of his classmates, had left him not chastened, but intrigued. He had asked questions about magical survival with a brightness too detached to be academic. He had taken to the Founders, too, not as a historian loves the past, but as a claimant loves inheritance. Dumbledore spent evenings in the school archives reading records he knew nearly by heart, and still distrustfully revisiting them. Prefect evaluations, examination, essays, disciplinary notes. The boy's brilliance remained intolerably clear from every page. Tom had been precise, where others were merely quick, graceful where others were merely handsome, and attentive to the weaknesses of adults in a manner that made praise feel like complicity in retrospect. Yet the documents betrayed other things too when read against the grain. His fondness for trophies, his pleasure in private distinction, his tendency to cultivate solitary authority rather than camaraderie. He had wanted witnesses to admire him, not equals to love him. One rainy evening, while turning over an old report from Professor Merithought on the wartime conduct of senior boys, Dumbledore found a line that caught him with almost physical force. "Riddle," she wrote, "displays an unusual composure around death and danger. One has the sense he is studying both for future advantage." Dumbledore set the parchment aside and closed his eyes. Study for future advantage. Even then, when he reopened them, the route before him had become clearer. If Tom had prepared against death, then the preparation would not begin with the man styled Lord Voldemort. It would begin with the boy who first resented his own limits. Dumbledore would need to go backwards, beyond the murders publicly attributed to the Dark Lord, beyond his first followers and first speeches, back into the private geography of his becoming. Not because origins excuse what follows, but because certain natures leave fingerprints on every age they inhabit. He made a list. Wool's Orphanage, Little Hangleton. Borgin and Burkes. Any surviving connection to Hepzibah Smith. Horace Slughorn, if courage or shame could be made to serve. Relics associated with the Founders, especially those that might flatter blood, pedigree, or legend. He looked at the names and felt the old weary tightening in his chest that preceded any serious campaign. Investigation requires a peculiar faith. One must believe that pattern exists even when the human beings inside it tried all their lives to disguise themselves as chaos. Fawkes gave a low note from the perch, as if in answer. Dumbledore rolled up the parchment. Somewhere in the castle below, a class bell rang and sent the ordinary day moving on its rails. Students crossed corridors carrying books. Teachers argued over timetables. Supper would be served. Essays would be marked. Children would go on becoming themselves. And he, while the school continued to rehearse civilization, would begin tracing the private education of the boy who had once sat within its walls and learned from them not humility, but ambition. What had happened in Harry Potter's nursery had not been an ending. Dumbledore was nearly certain of that now. It was a failure, yes, and a catastrophe, and perhaps the first true wound Tom Riddle had ever suffered at another's hands. But it was also the exposure of a prior act, something prepared long before the curse rebounded. The question was no longer whether Tom had intended to survive. The question was how many times he had arranged to do it. Research, when undertaken by a guilty man, takes on the habits of penance. Dumbledore traveled more in the years after Voldemort's fall than most of the wizarding world ever guessed. He traveled discreetly, because publicity is fatal to inquiries built upon other people's embarrassment, and because he had learned in youth that when one approaches the past with enough noise, the past obligingly rearranges itself into flattery. He wanted no such courtesy. He wanted the unvarnished thing. He spoke to old colleagues who had survived Tom Riddle's school years and discovered, not for the first time, that memory is least reliable where charm is operated long. Half of them still began by praising the boy's manners. Several laughed softly as they recalled his ambition, as though it had been merely decorative in so handsome a student. One former prefect described Tom's gaze as strangely mature, then fell quiet when Dumbledore asked whether mature was the same as kind. It seldom had been. He read staff correspondence from the years immediately after Tom left Hogwarts and found traces of what would later become visible as method. Requests for references worded with elegant humility. Notes of gratitude so perfectly turned that their effect was almost narcotic. Reports, years later, of young witches and wizards abruptly altering the course of their lives after a friendship, romance, or association with one Tom Riddle. Always because he had opened their eyes, recognized their talent, understood their place in the world. Tom had recruited in the manner of a seducer and built obedience in the manner of a collector. Old newspapers yielded their own miserable crop, antiquities changing hands in discreet private sales. A society widow, in possession of founder-connected heirlooms, entertaining a remarkably handsome young man, from a respectable but tragic background. Rumors, never quite printable, of objects gone missing after visits that had at first been remembered only as flattering. Even before he had gathered power, Tom had been curating meaning around himself. He liked old names, old medals, old stories. He preferred relics to money not because he disdained wealth, but because relics could be made to signify destiny. That taste led, inevitably, to Horcruxes Burke. Dumbledore did not yet go to Nocturne Alley. Timing mattered. Burke was the sort of man who locked his honesty in stages, and there was no use approaching him before the surrounding evidence had narrowed his options. Still, there were ledgers accessible through less direct channels, and several former ministry clerks retained perfect recall for the legal edges of transactions the law had never quite managed to police. From them, Dumbledore learned enough to confirm Tom's employment at Borgin and Burkes had not been a youthful detour born of poverty. He had chosen the shop because it placed in his hands the intimate traffic between old families and cursed beauty. Through its counters and cabinets passed vanity, greed, lineage, and secret fear. It had been, for Tom, an education finer than any apprenticeship. The pattern was not only in objects, it was in places. Little Hangleton returned repeatedly in ways too faint to notice unless one was already looking. A local death, a vanished heir, a shack long after abandoned yet not wholly empty of traces. Tom's life, so determined to rename itself, kept circling its ugliest beginnings as if loathing were a form of attachment. That, too, Dumbledore understood better than he liked. Men who declare themselves remade are often most fiercely governed by the soil they think they have kicked from their shoes. There were gaps. There are always gaps where murder and shame have worked together. But by degrees, the negative space around Tom began to resemble a design. He had not loved randomly. He had not killed randomly. He had not collected randomly. He had not hidden himself, if he had hidden himself, in places or vessels beneath his vanity. This last realization took longest because Dumbledore resisted it. Vanity, when joined to power, creates a peculiar blindness in those who oppose it. One assumes the vain man to be reckless, conspicuous, self-betraying. Often he is. Yet true vanity contains also a kind of fastidiousness. Tom would not entrust the deepest guarantee of his being to a stone in a field, or a ring tossed anonymously into ocean dark. If he had made of his own survival a right, then the right would have chosen altars. Founder relics. Ancestral tokens. Places where fear had once acknowledged him. The thought sent Dumbledore eventually toward the child again. There is a tendency among moralists to prefer monsters at full size. A child who becomes monstrous is inconvenient to simple language. The innocent face ruins the argument. Dumbledore had spent enough years with Tom's adult cruelties, echoing through the world to discover in himself an opposite danger. He had begun to think of the man so wholly that the child receded into abstraction. Yet whatever great obscenity had happened at Godric's Hollow did not arise from nowhere. It had roots, and roots are found in smaller rooms. So he searched for the orphanage. London had changed since the first time he had climbed those steps with his hat in his hands and his caution politely disguised. Neighborhoods had shifted. Bombing had altered street lines. Municipal reforms had folded institutions together, or renamed them without improving them. For 2 weeks he found only fragments, a committee archive in which a matron's reports had been copied badly, a social worker's memoir too self-important to be useful, an old council map that referred to the building under a different parish designation. Then, in a grim office where files were kept with all the tenderness of receipts, he found the trail. Wolves had been closed, absorbed, half-converted, and finally left to gentler forms of ruin. He went on a gray afternoon. The building stood in a tired London street between a laundrette and a warehouse gone to seed, its brick blackened by soot old enough to have become character rather than damage. Some of the windows had been boarded. Others stared out with cheap replacement glass. The front steps remained, though more worn. Dumbledore paused at the gate, one gloved hand resting on the iron, and for a moment the years between thinned with almost painful ease. He saw again the narrow room in which an 11-year-old boy had sat among pilfered trophies, and spoken of his difference not with fear, but with pleasure. He heard again that cool voice saying he could speak to snakes, make bad things happen, know things without being told. There had been loneliness in the child, yes, but loneliness is not innocence. Tom had cherished his separateness before the wizarding world ever arrived to reward it. Dumbledore entered the yard and crossed to the door. Inside, dust and bureaucratic afterlife greeted him. The place had been repurposed badly and abandoned worse. Yet institutions, however neglected, are loyal to paper. Somewhere in the rooms above or below, there would still be traces of the children once inventoried here, and among them, the one boy who had taken from deprivation, not humility, but entitlement. Dumbledore meant to find every trace the building had kept. As he climbed the dim staircase, the boards answering softly beneath his weight, he felt the past gather around him in a shape both intimate and hostile. Some investigations begin in libraries. Others begin where old sorrows have had time to mold into the plaster. He reached the landing and stood a moment in the corridor, listening to the house breathe through cracked pipes and weathered beams. Then he moved toward the room where Tom Riddle had once lived, and where perhaps the first true pattern of his secret life still waited to be read. Wool's orphanage had shrunk. That was Dumbledore's first clear thought as he walked the upper corridor. Not in any literal sense, though the ceilings seemed lower than he remembered, and the windows meaner, their panes letting in a diluted London light that turned every wall the color of old dishwater. Rather, it had shrunk in the imagination. Places of formative dread often do. When one first enters them under the burden of responsibility, they loom with the authority of a test. Years later, one returns to find threadbare curtains, warped floorboards, stale air, and the almost insulting mediocrity of the rooms in which lives were deformed. Evil likes grandeur in retrospect. In youth, it is very often housed in institutions that smell of boiled cabbage and cheap soap. He stood for a while outside the door that had once opened onto Tom's room. The wood had been repainted since those years, then chipped again, and whatever small brass plate had once carried a dormitory number was long gone. Yet memory supplied the rest with indecent ease. The narrow bed, the wardrobe, the box of stolen things under the bed, and Tom himself, sitting unnaturally still, watching a visitor not as children watch adults, but as young predators watch an approaching dog, measuring whether it is frightened enough to be taught fear. I can make them hurt if I want to. He had not understood then how literal a promise the child had been making to himself. Dumbledore opened his eyes and stepped away from the window. He moved farther down the corridor, into the old schoolroom where copybooks and slates had once been kept, and found there what he had half expected: a squat iron cabinet left unlocked by the bureaucratic laziness that follows institutions into ruin. Inside, beneath ledgers swollen by damp and bundles of yellowed forms tied with string, lay the remnant of the orphanage's administrative memory. Admissions registers, medical notes, lists of outings, complaints written in Mrs. Cole's impatient hand and signed off by committees that had not wanted to know too much about anything. He carried the top bundle to a table by the window and untied the string. Tom's name appeared more than once, and always with the faint irritant of exception attached to it. Bright child, difficult temperament, keeps to himself, disturbs others, never caught in mischief, though mischief occurs around him. Dumbledore read line after line in silence, feeling anew the old sensation of tracing a river back to the spring, only to discover the source was already poisoned. There were reports of petty cruelties, impossible to prove. A rabbit found hanging from rafters. A toy box rifled though no lock had been forced. A boy refusing to sleep in the bed beside Tom's after waking to find his blankets full of dead insects. No one had understood that such incidents were not childish malice, but experiments in sovereignty. Tom had wanted to see what fear looked like when he made it himself. Midway through the packet he found the seaside outing. Mrs. Cole's writing grew angrier over those pages, as if irritation were the only shield she could raise against unease. 2 children, Amy Benson and Dennis Bishop, had accompanied the rest of the orphanage to the coast. During the afternoon they had gone missing with Tom for several hours, found later near the cliff path by local men. Both children upset, would not explain what happened in the cave. Dennis mute for the rest of the day, Amy screaming during the night. Tom returned calm. Unrepentant was underlined twice. Dumbledore set the page down and looked out at the wet lane again. A cave. Not simply a hidden corner or a cupboard under stairs, but a place shaped by depth and salt and darkness. A place whose secrecy had delighted Tom enough to be remembered for years afterward. He had taken other children there and done something to them that left no bruise a matron could document, and yet changed them all the same. Even at 11, he had been rehearsing the uses of terror. Not for gain, not even for anger. For pleasure, perhaps, but more truly for definition. He had wanted a stage on which his difference could become undeniable. And later, as a young man, he would choose another cave by the sea to safeguard a thing he believed indispensable. The connection rose in Dumbledore's mind, not as certainty but as form. Tom returning to places that had confirmed him. Tom nesting his most private acts in locations where fear and memory already belonged to him. The pattern was becoming visible at last. The orphanage, the gaunt ruins, Hogwarts, old houses of old blood. Not random concealment, but biography rendered as magic. If Tom had hidden his survival in fragments, he would have hidden each fragment in a place or an object that enlarged his sense of himself. He replaced the file with care, though no one remained alive who would come seeking it. Before he closed the cabinet, however, something in the lower drawer caught his eye. A small cardboard box, lid crushed, containing odds and ends cleared from the dormitories and never claimed. Broken buttons. A tarnished spoon. A brass soldier missing one arm. A stone with a hole worn through its center. Trifles without value. Yet looking at them he saw the seed of the man more clearly than in any testimony. Tom's first empire had been made of small thefts, not because he needed what he stole, but because possession itself taught him the shape of power. To take, to hide, to revisit in secret. It had all begun here. He closed the drawer and stood for a long while in the dim corridor. his wand light lowering until it was little more than a gold bead. He thought, unwillingly, of the day he had first brought Tom to Diagon Alley, of the boy's composure, of the avidity beneath it, of his own decision to meet pride with controlled force, to set the wardrobe on fire, and show the child that he could not dominate the room unchallenged. It had been necessary. He believed that still. Yet necessity has a way of curdling into self-justification when examined too lovingly, and Dumbledore had spent enough of his life in the shadow of his own certainties to distrust them. Could he have reached Tom differently? Could anyone? The question had no use and therefore insisted on being asked. When he finally left the orphanage, London had deepened into one of those gray afternoons that made all windows look tired. He walked several streets before apparating, cloak dark against the soot-stained brick, and as he went he began arranging Tom's life not as chronology but as constellation. Places of origin, places of humiliation, places of exaltation, objects stolen, coveted, inherited, an orphan's room, a sea cave, a shack in Little Hangleton, a school where ancient founders had left relics and legends enough to intoxicate any clever boy with delusions of destiny. He did not yet have the word that would order all his suspicions into one abominable answer, but he was close enough now to smell it. Nocturne Alley smelled, as ever, of damp velvet, old metal, and moral compromise. Dumbledore preferred to come there in rain. Rain kept people indoors, shortened arguments, and laid a sheen over the crooked stones that turned the whole alley into something treacherously reflective. On bright days, the place advertised its corruption with a certain vulgar confidence. Under weather, it looked older and more honest. There were shops here that had survived the collapse of ministries and the execution of patrons simply by learning to stock what fear desired and never asking what fear intended to do with it afterward. Borgin and Burkes crouched near the far end of the alley behind a window full of objects no decent household would have permitted within a mile of its nursery. A withered hand rested upon faded velvet. Several necklaces gleamed with a beauty too calculating to be innocent. In the back, half seen through greenish glass, a cabinet stood draped in black cloth as if ashamed of itself. Dumbledore entered without glamour. Sometimes disguise opened doors. Reputation opened others more efficiently. A bell rang overhead in a note so sour it sounded disappointed to have been disturbed. From behind a stack of cabinets there emerged an elderly wizard in plum-colored robes, whose face looked as if greed had pulled it inward over the years, tightening the skin around the eyes until all expression resembled caution. Caractacus Burke had been old when Tom Riddle worked here. He had outlasted his own respectability by decades. For one astonished beat he forgot to arrange his face. "Professor Dumbledore," he said then, smiling with exquisite insincerity. "To what do we owe?" "The truth, I hope," Dumbledore said. Burke laughed too quickly. "My dear Professor, truth is a flexible commodity in retail. May I offer you anything in particular? We have a cursed opal necklace newly returned from private hands, perfectly safe if not worn, and a goblin. I have not come to purchase." Burke's fingers, jeweled and yellowish at the joints, closed over one another. "Then perhaps to inspect? We are, I assure you, entirely within ministry guidelines." "No, are you?" The old dealer let the smile fall. They stood among the objects in a silence that felt watched. Somewhere in the back room a chain shifted with a metallic complaint. Rain tapped at the leaded glass in the front window. Dumbledore began to walk slowly through the shop. He did not touch anything. He merely looked, and Burke moved after him with the air of a man following a lit taper through a room full of spilled powder. "Tom Riddle worked for you," Dumbledore said. Burke's answer came after a pause, just a fraction too long. Briefly. "He impressed you. He impressed everybody." "Yes," Dumbledore said, stopping before a cabinet of rings. "That was one of his gifts." Burke licked his lips. "I cannot see what business a dead employee." "Not dead," Dumbledore said softly. The words struck harder than a shout might have. Burke's pupils widened. For all his worldliness, He remained precisely the sort of man who believed bad news could be fended off if one moved quickly enough into the next sentence. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "Nothing whatever. The Dark Lord Riddle. He was long gone from my concern by the time all that started. A charming young fellow, very polished. Quite wasted in retail, if you ask me. But what he became after." "What he became," said Dumbledore, "did not emerge from a vacuum." Burke watched him and understood, at last, that this would not be a conversation he could prize. Dumbledore turned back to the cabinets. In the glass he could see Burke's reflection behind him, pinched and restless. "I am interested in the objects that passed through your hands while Tom worked here, particularly those connected with old bloodlines and the founders of Hogwarts." "Aye." Burke made a helpless movement. "Professor, this is an establishment of discretion." "Then be discreet. You need not shout the answer." The old man's gaze flickered to the front window, as if measuring flight, then to Dumbledore's wand hand, as if measuring the futility of it. At length he said, "There was a locket." Dumbledore remained very still. Burke, sensing that he had crossed the line already, rushed on with the shabby bravado of a man who hopes speed may resemble courage. Years before Riddle was employed here, a woman came in half-starved and near-crazed, claimed descent from Salazar Slytherin, which usually means lunacy or drink, but the thing she had was genuine enough. An ornate gold locket with serpentine engraving. I bought it for a sum it was not worth and one day regretted. Such transactions are complicated. "Merop Gaunt," Dumbledore said. Burke blinked. "You know the name." "I know many names. Continue." "He knew about it," Burke muttered. "Riddle. He had a nose for stories. Once he was old enough to understand what had passed through the shop before him, he developed an interest in that piece. Asked to see the ledger. Asked where it had gone. I did not tell him everything." "Nay." Dumbledore turned enough to look at him directly. "No?" Burke's mouth twitched. "Not at first." And there it was. The truth one found so often at the bottom of respectable evasions. Not loyalty. Not terror. Vanity. Burke had enjoyed being necessary to brilliance, as small men often did when genius deigned to use them. "Hepzibah Smith," Dumbledore said. Burke's shoulders dropped the smallest amount. "You know that too." "I know she acquired the locket. I know she owned another relic of unusual significance. I know she died under suspicious circumstances for which her house elf was blamed. What I do not yet know is precisely how much Tom learned from you before he went to call on her." The old dealer's face took on a waxen quality. "I did not tell him to kill her. I did not say you did." "That isn't what I meant." Burke swallowed. He was curious. Ambitious. You've known ambitious boys, Professor. He asked what collectors would pay for founder objects, what private families still claimed such things, who had real taste and who merely money. He had a way of making questions sound flattering. One talked more than one intended. "None. Da-da." Dumbledore let the silence answer for him. "Yes," Burke said miserably. "Yes, I spoke of Hepzibah. Many did. She was old, rich, vain, and adored handsome company. She liked to display what she owned. The cup of Helga Hufflepuff. Slytherin's locket. Trinkets from forgotten lines. She was proud of her cabinets, proud of her blood, proud of any young man who looked at her as though she were still the center of a room." His voice roughened with something not quite pity. "Riddle could look at people that way. He made you feel your importance with the same motion by which he measured your weakness." "Did he mention any other objects?" Burke hesitated. "Not by name, but he asked once whether anything of Rowena Ravenclaw's had ever come to market. I laughed at him. Such things are legend." He didn't laugh. Dumbledore felt the pieces move again. "Slytherin by blood. Hufflepuff by theft. Ravenclaw by aspiration." Tom had never been modest in his symbolic appetites. "Did he keep anything here?" Dumbledore asked. "No." "Nothing? No private cabinet, no sealed package? No item entrusted under false description? Nothing I would know of. Burke's answer came quicker now, as if truth in one direction had made falsehood less profitable in another. He was too careful for that. If he had anything of value, he did not leave it where anyone else held the key. Dumbledore believed him. He moved to the front counter where an old ledger lay half open. The ink on the visible page had browned with age. Burke's hand twitched toward it, then thought better. Dumbledore placed 2 fingers lightly on the paper and murmured a revealing charm. Several lines glimmered. Names, dates, coded abbreviations. One page, many years old, briefly brightened around an entry for a gold locket, sold to H. Smith. Another, later page, showed Tom Riddle's neat hand beside inventory annotations too orderly to be accidental. Riddle had handled the ledgers. He had mapped the trajectories of blood and relic and vanity from behind this very counter. There are men who learn the world by traveling through it. Tom had preferred catalogs. "I will require a copy of these records," Dumbledore said. Burke looked affronted. "On what authority?" "On mine." "That is not legal." "No," Dumbledore said pleasantly. "It is wiser." The old man understood then that refusal might be theatrically satisfying and practically disastrous. He bowed his head in a motion one step removed from a flinch. While Burke shuffled off to find the relevant pages, Dumbledore stood by the window and watched rain bead down the glass over the alley outside. He could feel the shop around him like a set of teeth. Every object here had once been desired enough to justify risk. Some desires were as simple as greed. Others were subtler and far more ruinous. Tom Riddle's had always combined both. He wanted beautiful things, yes. But more than that, he wanted to inhabit meanings larger than himself. Founder relics were not only valuable, they were genealogies of reverence. To possess them was to annex history. Burke returned with copies charmed into damp-smelling parchment. His hands shook slightly as he passed them over. "One more question," Dumbledore said. The dealer's face emptied. "Must there be?" "Yes, when he handled such things. Relics, I mean. Did he ever seem merely pleased?" Burke frowned, uncertain how to answer something so imprecise. Then, to Dumbledore's surprise, he answered well. "No," he said. "Never merely pleased. Possessed, perhaps. Or in love. If love had knives in it." Dumbledore took the parchments. When he stepped back into the alley, the rain had slackened to a mist. The crooked buildings loomed over him like conspirators caught listening. He did not apparate at once. Instead, he walked the length of Nocturne and out toward the cleaner stones of Diagon Alley, where ordinary commerce was already lighting its evening lamps and pretending not to know what shadowed district lay only a few turns away. In his pocket, the copied records were dampening against the warmth of his hand. A locket. A cup. A question about Ravenclaw. Founder objects and bloodline heirlooms. Caches, trophies, symbols. Tom's soul, Dumbledore thought, if indeed he had done what only the darkest texts permitted, would not have been hidden in some anonymous pebble tossed into the sea. It would have been enthroned. And once one understands a tyrant's vanity, one is halfway to finding his secrets. Nicolas Flamel received him in a room that smelled of cinnamon, old paper, and patiently mastered danger. The house in which Nicolas and Perenelle lived was one of those dwellings that seemed less built than accreted, as if centuries of scholarship had laid down one stone, then another, around the original modest structure, until it became a labyrinth of staircases, workrooms, glazed galleries, and quiet fires. Alchemical apparatus shone on shelves like captive constellations. Mortars worn smooth by generations of use sat beside codices whose clasps were older than most reigning dynasties. Everywhere there was evidence of the peculiar domesticity of great age. Slippers warming by the hearth, a shawl hung over a chair, an unfinished chess problem near a bowl of pears. Perenelle kissed Dumbledore's cheek and looked at him exactly once before saying, "You have the expression you wore when Grindelwald first became a problem instead of an idea." It was an unkind observation only because it was accurate. "I'd I'd hoped, Dumbledore said, never to wear it again. Hope, she murmured, handing him a cup fragrant with some restorative infusion, is useful if taken in moderation. Nicolas laughed softly and motioned him toward the long table by the fire. He had grown very small with age, but not frail. There remained in him the alert inward brightness of those whose minds continue to labor even when the body has made its separate peace with limitation. His eyes, clear as pale amber, rested on Dumbledore with a courtesy too old for surprise. "You did not come for pleasantries," Nicolas said, "which means the matter is serious enough to outrank your manners." Dumbledore sat. The cup warmed his hands, though not enough. "I need information on methods of unnatural persistence." Nicolas' gaze sharpened at once. How unnatural? Worse than ghost-making. Perenelle, moving about the hearth with the assurance of long companionship, slowed but did not turn. Nicolas was silent for so long that the fire made most of the room's conversation in his place. "At our age," he said at last, "one learns not to be shocked by categories, only by particulars. Tell me the particular." "Nah, unbesorgd." Dumbledore did. "Not everything. Not the prophecy, nor the child on the doorstep, nor the full guilty architecture of all his fears. But enough. The fall at Godric's Hollow, the missing body, the mark that had not died on a servant's arm, Tom Riddle's childhood appetite for trophies, his later fixation on founder relics, his hatred of mortality." He spoke with the precision of a man laying evidence before a judge he trusted not to mistake eloquence for proof. Nicolas listened without interruption. When Dumbledore finished, the old alchemist folded his hands upon the table and looked for a moment not at him but into the fire. "There are," Nicolas said slowly, "three broad kinds of cheating one attempts with death. The first is fraud of the body. Elixirs, stones, transmutations, the prolonging of flesh by supplying it with what it cannot make for itself. That is my field, and even there the work is not conquest but maintenance. The body remains one body. The self remains one self. One pays independence for every borrowed year." "Nani?" Perenelle set a small plate of bread and salt on the table between them. She had heard this taxonomy before. "The second kind," Nicolas continued, "is evacuation, ghosthood, portraiture, echoes, impressions, survivals of pattern. Better than oblivion, perhaps, but not life, and often not dignity." "And the third?" Dumbledore asked, though he already knew from Nicolas' face that he would hate the answer. Nicolas met his gaze. "Mutilation." The words seemed to lower the room's temperature. "Ancient dark practitioners," Nicolas said, "discovered what all sane magicians should have been content not to discover, that the soul, though not a material organ, can be damaged by moral action so profoundly that the damage may be directed. Murder rends it. That is old knowledge. Most cultures veil it in metaphor and are wise to do so. A deliberate ripping, however, followed by enchantment to confine the torn piece outside this." Dumbledore set down his cup very carefully. "A fragment anchored in an object." "Yes." Silence held for a beat, then another. The fire popped. "Is it possible," Dumbledore asked, "to survive in such a state if the body is destroyed?" Nicolas' mouth thinned. "That is the point of the obscenity." Perenelle came to stand behind her husband's chair, one hand resting lightly on the carved wood. Her face had gone hard with ancient disgust. "There are not many texts left on the practice," she said. "Most were destroyed for good reason. The few that survive are walled around by institutions too proud to admit they keep them." "Hogwarts," Dumbledore said. Nicolas gave him the tiniest shrug. "Hogwarts. Certain private collections. Some continental vaults. The term you want is Horcrux." "None. Gajara." Even expecting the answer, Dumbledore felt the words strike him like cold iron laid against skin. Horcrux. He had heard it once, perhaps twice, decades earlier in the scattered company of scholars who catalogued horrors, in order that others might never need to know their names. It had remained among those terms once stored far from daily thought, not because it was obscure, but because it was indecent. Naming something often grants the mind a measure of control over it. Certain practices seem to stain language merely by being spoken aloud. "How many have ever been made?" he asked. Nicolas gave a weary little movement of the fingers. "Successfully, very few. Sanity resists the process if conscience does not. One tears not only the soul but the mind's coherence. Most who contemplate such a thing are either too ignorant to complete it or too damaged afterward to profit by completion." Tom Riddle, Dumbledore thought, would have taken that as a challenge. "Could one make more than one?" he asked. This time Nicolas did not answer immediately. His eyes shifted to Perenelle, and something passed between them that had the intimacy of shared revulsion. "In theory," Nicolas said at last, "yes. In practice, it would be abomination compounded by madness. Each division leaves the maker less whole, less human, more dependent on the artificial moorings he has made. To attempt multiple divisions would require not merely cruelty, but an almost liturgical devotion to self-annihilation in the name of self-preservation." Dumbledore sat back. For a moment the room seemed to tilt very slightly, as if all the old and civil objects around him had recoiled from the idea. Multiple divisions. The child's scar on Privet Drive burned in memory beneath his fingers. Nicolas rose with more stiffness than he would ever have admitted and crossed to a cabinet fitted with 7 locks. From it he withdrew a thin volume bound in black leather cracked to the color of dried blood. He laid it on the table without opening it. "I am lending you this," he said. "You will dislike yourself for reading it. Return it nonetheless." "May." Dumbledore touched the cover. The leather was cold. "What is it?" "A digest compiled by 3 different scholars at 3 different points in history, all of them in the mistaken belief that knowledge can be sterilized by scholarship. The section on Horcruxes is concise and nauseating. The first author considered them theoretical. The second had seen the aftermath of one. The third tried to argue that no absolute prohibition should exist in magic and was killed by his own apprentice, which I have always taken as moral clarification." No. Against any other backdrop, Dumbledore might almost have smiled. Instead, he said, "Thank you." Nicolas' gaze grew gentler. "You fear this is what your former student has done." "Yes. And you fear," Perenelle said quietly, "that he may have gone further than anyone decent would imagine." Dumbledore looked at the dark volume under his hand and did not pretend otherwise. He remained with them until evening deepened and the windows turned black. They spoke of methods of destruction no little with certainty. Substances and forces that attacked enchantment at the level of magical structure rather than mere surface. Venoms infused with inherent lethality. Fires whose nature was consumption rather than heat. Goblin-forged blades capable of taking into themselves that which strengthened them. Old, perilous categories. Not yet answers, but directions. When he returned to Hogwarts, the castle was already quiet. He went not to bed, but directly to the headmaster's office, set the black volume beside the lamp, and read until dawn emptied his face of warmth. The text was spare, which made it worse. Murder to rend. Spellwork to seal. The main fragment placed within an object prepared to receive it. The object thereafter existing not as sentient thing but as vessel, anchor, contingency. A Horcrux did not preserve humanity. It merely denied final consequence. The mutilated soul remained tethered to earth while the body lived or died, and while any Horcrux remained intact, the Maker could not wholly pass beyond mortal existence. On the final page of the section, in the mean little hand of the third commentator, there was a note speculating on multiplicity. The souls of some men, it suggested, may be so meagerly integrated already that repeated division would not destroy them at once, though it would produce profound degradation of appearance and reason. Dumbledore closed the book and sat for a very long time without moving. In the pale light of early morning, the office looked suddenly indecent in its orderliness. Silver instruments ticking, books aligned, a phoenix sleeping with his head under scarlet wing. On the desk before him lay a term at once precise and abyssal. Horcrux. He wrote it down only once. The ink seemed to darken more than it should have. Horace Slughorn had retired into upholstery. The cottage he had taken in the countryside managed to look both overfurnished and vaguely temporary, as though he had moved in with the intention of making himself comfortable before the world came to its senses and recalled him to importance. Velvet draped every surface that did not already glint. Cabinets displayed crystallized pineapple, silver-framed photographs, cut glass decanters, and little trophies of acquaintance, notes from ministers, signed cards from former pupils, a stirring spoon said to have belonged to some distant aunt of a famous harp. The place smelled of polished wood, expensive tobacco, and self-indulgence practiced as defense. Slughorn greeted Dumbledore with obvious pleasure that curdled almost at once into apprehension. "My dear Albus," he boomed, though his small mustache twitched. "What an honor. You should have sent word. I'd have had the house tidied. Not that it isn't perfectly respectable as is, but one hates the appearance of idleness." "Men, it appears comfortable," Dumbledore said. "Comfortable? Well, yes, one does what one can after the years of service we gave that school. Sit, brandy, tea. I have a marvelous little quince preserve from a girl in York whose grandmother I once recommended to St. Mungo's. Tea, perhaps?" Slughorn fussed happily until he remembered to be wary again. He poured, offered cakes, laughed too loudly at his own remarks, and all the while Dumbledore watched the older man's eyes flick and measure and retreat. Horace had always preferred the atmosphere of safety to the fact of it. He liked rooms in which danger entered only as gossip. When they were seated with steaming cups between them and the first soft trivialities exhausted, Dumbledore said, "I have been looking into Tom Riddle's school years." The effect was immediate. Slughorn's teacup halted halfway to his mouth. Something almost physical seemed to pass over his face, as a cloud passes over polished silver and reveals the tarnish beneath. "Have you?" he said. "I have. Sad business. Brilliant boy. Terrible end." "Not end," said Dumbledore. Slughorn set the cup down too carefully. "My dear Albus, really, if you've come here to discuss post-war nerves, I'm afraid retirement has not improved my patience for melodrama." Dumbledore regarded him over the rim of his own tea. Horace tried to smile, and fail. "I know about Horcruxes," Dumbledore said. The room went silent as a struck bell. One could almost hear the words settling among the velvet and silver, turning every comfortable object in the parlor slightly obscene by proximity. Slughorn stared at him. The color receded from his cheeks, leaving the skin shiny and older than the room permitted. "I don't know what you mean," he whispered. "Yes, you do." "No." Chum. The answer came with shocking force. "No, I do not. I won't have... Really, Albus, one hears all manner of filth in wartime. One cannot be expected to..." "He asked you." Slughorn rose so suddenly that his cup tipped and spilled tea across a table crowded with framed photographs. He did not notice. He stood with both hands flat upon the polished surface, breathing harder than the movement warranted. "Get out," he said. Dumbledore remained seated. "Horace, tea. I said get out. People are dead." Slughorn made a sound that might have been a laugh had it not broken in the middle. "Do you imagine I've forgotten? Do you imagine there is an hour in which I forget?" Dumbledore said nothing. Slughorn's face had begun to sag under the weight of memory. "He was a boy," he said. "A gifted boy. Hungry, yes, and vain enough to be tiresome. But they are all vain at that age when they know they're clever. Merlin help us, we liked them clever in those days. We polished them. We fed them compliments and opportunities and little invitations to better tables. We called it encouragement. And he came to you with a question no decent teacher should have answered." Slughorn's hands clenched on the table. "I did not answer it. Not properly." "Not properly," Dumbledore repeated. The older man turned away, crossing to the fire with a swiftness oddly rabbit-like. He stood with his back to the room, broad shoulders rounded inside a sumptuous waistcoat, and for a while Dumbledore thought perhaps this would end in refusal after all. But shame, if tended too long, sometimes becomes easier to confess than to continue carrying alone. "He came after supper," Slughorn said without turning. "My rooms. There were candied peels on the tray, and those little eclairs Rosmerta used to send up when I asked. Absurdly rich things. He had a paper on some defensive principle, or pretended to. Perfectly mannered. Perfectly calm. You know how he was when he wanted something." "No." "Yes, I thought." Slughorn stopped, swallowed. "I thought he wanted to impress me. It was always flattering with Tom to be singled out. He made older people feel they had discovered him rather than the other way around." He gave a tiny, hateful laugh at himself. "There is no fool, quite like an old fool who believes youth admires him disinterestedly." Dumbledore let that truth stand. "He asked," Slughorn said, voice thinning, "whether the soul could be split. There it was, plainly now. No alteration, no evasion." Dumbledore's hands tightened under the table where Slughorn could not see. "I told him," Slughorn went on, "that there were very dark theories. I should have ended it there. I should have thrown him out. I should have taken 20 points and written to you that night. Instead, I let vanity continue the conversation. He had that way of seeming already to know enough that one was only confirming scholarship, not enabling wickedness. I asked why he wanted to know. He said he had come across references while reading and found them obscure. He smiled. I talked. He turned then, and there were tears standing in his eyes, though his face worked stubbornly against them. He asked about Horcruxes by name, Slughorn said. He asked what they did. I said they anchored the soul outside the body. He was fascinated. Not repelled, fascinated. Then he asked whether one could make more than one. Dumbledore's heartbeat, old as he was, struck once hard in his throat. And what did you say? That it was impossible to contemplate without revulsion. Slughorn wiped at his mouth with the back of his hand. He pressed, not in a wild way, in that horrible gentle way. He said that 7 was the most powerfully magical number. He asked whether splitting the soul into 7 parts would grant particular strength. I told him the act itself was murder, mutilation beyond endurance. He looked almost disappointed that I objected to the aesthetics of the thing. And then, Slughorn's voice cracked. And then he thanked me, perfectly politely, as though I had recommended a better wine. Me. Da. For a while, the only sound in the room was the fire settling in its grate. 7. Not one contingency made in panic. Not one obscene experiment. Deliberate multiplication. Ritualized self-violation in pursuit of permanence. Even having feared as much, Dumbledore found the shape of it nauseating. Why did you never tell me? He asked. Slughorn shut his eyes. Because to tell you would have been to admit that I had sat in my own room and discussed soul murder with a child. Because I was ashamed. Because when he began to rise, everyone was already saying he had gone dark through blood mania and politics, and the company he kept, and I could not bear to know I had placed one stone in the road myself. He drew a ragged breath. Because people like me are always certain there will be another chance to do the brave thing later, when it is less embarrassing. Dumbledore could not argue. Too much of history was built on that delay. You altered the memory, he said. Slughorn flinched. Yes. Do you still have it? A long pause. At last Horace crossed to a bureau, unlocked a lower drawer with shaking fingers, and withdrew a stoppered crystal vial. In the silvering substance within, thoughts swirled like a storm cloud trapped in glass. I made myself another copy, he said. The true one. I told myself it was prudence, in case I ever needed proof of what I had not done. In truth, I think I kept it because some part of me knew cowardice should at least preserve evidence. He held the vial out with a hand that trembled so badly the memory within shivered. Dumbledore took it. The glass was cool. Through it he saw Slughorn's face magnified and warped, plump features made grotesque by curvature and tears. For one instant he felt not condemnation but pity. Pity for a weak man who had loved brilliance more than goodness, and found the price years later in names on memorial stones. "Thank you," Dumbledore said. Slughorn barked a laugh through tears. "Do not thank me. Arrest me, despise me, remove my portrait from the school someday. But do not thank me." Dumbledore rose. "I have done all three to myself already," Horace said more quietly. "You are late to the work." In Hogwarts that night, under lamplight unsoftened by upholstery or brandy, Dumbledore poured the memory into the pensieve and bent over its silver surface. He found himself in Slughorn's old office exactly as described. Supper things, comfortable clutter, the smell of crystallized fruit. And Tom, 16, immaculate, luminous with that eerie composure which made people mistake polished appetite for character. He sat with a question in his eyes and no trace of youth in his patience. Even watching as one who already knew the outcome, Dumbledore felt again the cold admiration Riddle had once inspired in almost everyone who met him. The boy had beauty like a blade newly drawn. The conversation unfolded. Not every word, for memory has its own emphasis, but enough. Horcrux. Murder. Split. Dot. More than one. 7. When Dumbledore withdrew, the office around him seemed changed in proportion, as though the furniture had learned a secret and been made slightly indecent by keeping it. On the desk lay his notes. No body, founder relics, childhood trophies, persistence after destruction. Now there was a number. Not merely survival, but architecture. He sat until the lamp oil burned low, thinking not only of the practical implications, but of the monstrous inward shape of such a choice. To make one Horcrux was to admit that the soul was expendable so long as the self continued. To aspire to 7 was to worship the self so completely that humanity became a series of negotiable losses. Tom had not feared becoming less. He had expected fragmentation to crown him. Dumbledore looked at the memory vial beside the pensieve and understood with renewed bitterness that cleverness untethered from conscience did not merely destroy others. It eventually abolished the one who wielded it, leaving only appetite with a wand. On a fresh sheet of parchment he wrote, "Confirmed. Multiple Horcruxes intended. Symbolic number. 7. Then beneath it, after a long hesitation, if he succeeded fully, I am looking for 6 deliberate vessels and what remains in the body." He stared at that final line until dawn paled the window. The ink did not change. Bob Ogden had retired badly. Dumbledore found him in a narrow house whose front garden had surrendered to nettles and whose parlors smelled of medicinal ointment, stale tea, and the slow grievance of old injuries. Once Ogden had served the ministry with the stubborn dignity of a man willing to be underestimated so long as the work got done. Age had not improved his opinion of people, but had sharpened his memory into something almost vindictive in its clarity. "Gaunts," he said when Dumbledore explained his purpose. "Filthy lot. Half mad, all proud. I still have the scar where Morphin's hex took me if you want an exhibit." "I will spare you the display," Dumbledore said. Ogden snorted and motioned him to sit. "Suppose you won't spare me the remembering." He did remember. More than Dumbledore had hoped for, perhaps because old civil servants are rarely granted audiences in which recollection is treated as treasure rather than nuisance. Ogden spoke of the visit to Little Hangleton decades earlier, of Morphin gaunt leering in the yard, of Marvolo swollen with ancestral arrogance, of Merop shrunken into silence beneath both of them. He spoke of the shack's smell, and the broken crockery, and the ring Marvolo flourished as proof of descent. He spoke, too, of the locket with the ornate S carved upon it, shabby then but unmistakably older than the room in which it hung. At Dumbledore's request, Ogden yielded the memory. In the pensieve, the scene was worse than the account. The Gaunt Shack crouched under a summer sky that seemed itself diseased. Chickens scratched in dirt too exhausted to be soil. Morphin's face, all furtive malice and unwashed triumph, peered through the doorway. Marvolo raged like a hereditary illness given voice. And Merup, whom Tom would later erase from his own mythology with the contempt children reserve for weakness they fear inheriting, stood there in rags with Slytherin's locket at her throat, and saw no future anywhere. Dumbledore lingered in the memory just long enough to study the ring. Black stone, set in cracked gold. Not beautiful in any ordinary sense, but old, and old in precisely the manner Tom found irresistible. Dense with lineage, ugly with entitlement, freighted with the conviction that history itself could be worn upon the hand. A family relic, and more than a family relic. Dumbledore, who had spent enough years among old names and older symbols, felt another intuition stirring at the edge of certainty. There was something beneath the Gaunt story. Something further back than Slytherin, though the memory did not reveal it. When he withdrew from the pensieve, Ogden was watching him with the morbid curiosity of a man who knows his recollections have become useful at last. "You think the boy went back there," Ogden said. "I know he did. At least in one sense," Dumbledore answered. "He fashioned himself out of that inheritance even while despising it." Ogden made a sour face. "Typical. Despise the family, keep the heirlooms." Dumbledore smiled despite himself. A concise summary of many aristocracies. By late afternoon, he stood outside the real shack under a sky the color of spoiled pewter. Little Hangleton had not improved with distance from the memory. The slope up to the cottage was a long scrape through dead grass and hard wind. The trees bent away from the place as if years of bad temper had taught them caution. The building itself seemed to have shrunk into the earth since Ogden's day. Roof sagging, windows blind, stones furred with rot and neglect. There are houses ruined by abandonment, and houses ruined by the people who live in them. This one had managed both. Dumbledore did not enter at once. He stood at the threshold and let his wand hand hang loose by his side, listening. Magic leaves silence of different kinds. Warm homes have a woven hush, lives braided into walls by repetition. Places of violence retain abruptness, a silence with edges on it. The Gaunt Shack had a third species entirely, a muttering stillness, as though the house had spent generations listening to the same resentments until even empty rooms felt crowded. He crossed the threshold. The stench was long gone, but memory of it seemed embedded in the beams. Broken furniture moldered where it had fallen. A cracked basin leaned against one wall. In the fireplace lay the white ghosts of ancient ash. Dumbledore moved slowly, reading with senses more practiced than sight. Dark magic had saturated the place in old layers, small hexes, domestic malice, curses cast for spite rather than strategy. None of that interested him. He searched for a concentration different in quality from the rest. Not the lingering smoke of repeated ugliness, but the sealed cold of intentional preservation. Near the center of the room, by a flagstone slightly more worn than its fellows, he felt it. Not strongly. Not yet. But enough. He crouched and passed his wand above the stone. At first the result was only a faint ripple in the air. He altered the spell, adding a strand of the diagnostic magic he had used at Godric's Hollow, and refined since reading the Horcrux texts. The ripple tightened. A small black vein appeared in the air above the flagstone, then vanished. Dumbledore sat back on his heels. Beneath that stone was something protected not merely by concealment, but by curses layered to repel contact and mislead inquiry. Not proof, but close enough to turn caution into necessity. He could have opened it. He even knew, in rough principle, how. There were lifting spells subtle enough not to trigger a common jinx, severing charms delicate enough to peel back a binding one thread at a time. But Horcruxes were not common jinxes, and Tom had not survived adolescence by underestimating his own ingenuity. If the ring lay beneath that stone, and if it was what Dumbledore increasingly believed, touching it without preparation would be recklessness disguised as boldness. He had spent too much of his youth in the company of men who made that disguise seem noble. Instead, he sealed the threshold behind him, laid 3 wards around the interior, and marked the location upon a private map. Then he stood in the middle of the shack and let himself, for just 1 minute, imagine Tom returning here in secret after leaving school. Perhaps after murder. Perhaps with blood still metaphysically fresh upon him. Returning to the squalor he had once loathed in order to exalt it with stolen permanence. Kneeling before the hearth. Lifting the stone. Setting down the vessel with the reverence only narcissists feel for objects that mirror them. The thought sickened him. Outside, the wind had risen. It moved over the hill with a sound like distant surf. And for an instant, the connection between Orphanage Cave and ancestral ruin seemed part of the same design. Tom's life was not a straight line. It was a series of returns. To fear. To secret places. To blood. To symbols. To the self. Dumbledore left the hill at dusk and apparated not back to Hogwarts, but to a lane outside the village graveyard, where the Riddle tombs stood among other old stones in their handsome, chilly dignity. He did not enter. He only looked through the railings at the white marble, and the self-satisfied names cut deep enough to resist weather. Tom had despised his father and murdered him. Yet he had also taken from that murder another form of inheritance, the certainty that blood, even rejected blood, was a narrative force. One did not escape lineage merely by hating it. One could also weaponize it. By the time Dumbledore returned to the castle, night had gathered thickly over the grounds. In his office he set Ogden's memory beside Burke's copied ledgers and Slughorn's confession and saw, with growing clarity, the likely shape of at least 3 deliberate Horcruxes. The ring hidden in the Gaunt Shack. Slytherin's locket, once in Hepzibah Smith's possession. Hufflepuff's cup, likewise stolen after murder. Possibly more. Likely more. He looked at the list and felt no triumph at the progress. Investigation had stripped the problem of speculation and clothed it in reality, which is never as satisfying as the detective stories pretend. Reality smelled of old misery and old shame and dark rooms in which people had trusted the wrong person. Still, reality had one advantage over fear. It could be hunted. Years passed with the indecency peculiar to years that contain a child. Wars announce themselves and are counted. Childhood vanishes by stealth. One summer becomes another. School robes grow in trunks waiting for futures not yet earned. The people charged with vigilance age in increments measurable only in hindsight, while the children at the center of their vigilance lengthen their limbs and lose their first teeth and learn, too early or too late, what sort of world has received them. Dumbledore kept his watch on Privet Drive with all the tools available to a man who could protect more thoroughly than he could comfort. Arabella Figg reported on bruised feelings and ill-fitting clothes, and the small practical humiliations that accumulate when a household decides one child is an intrusion rather than a member. The blood wards held. Petunia had done the minimum required by kinship and spite, which in magic still counted as consent. Harry remained safe from many things and deprived of others less quantifiable, but no less necessary. At first, Dumbledore told himself safety must suffice. By Harry's 7th summer, he no longer believed any such thing and continued to tell himself it anyway. That evening, the light lingered late over Surrey, laying a false gentleness on the trimmed hedges and pebble-dashed walls. From down the street came the muted clatter of dishes and televisions and one man's laugh too loud for the joke that had earned it. Arabella had sent word that Harry was in the garden alone. Vernon Dursley had shouted at him during supper for some offense connected with peas. Dudley had chased him earlier with a stick. None of it was unusual. That was part of the obscenity. Dumbledore stood beyond the end of the lane under a stand of thin trees that did not belong to Privet Drive's idea of itself. He had come first to check the wards, as he did from time to time, and remained because habit and guilt had learned to conspire. Through gaps in the hedges he could see a wedge of the Dursleys' back garden. Harry sat near the fence where the grass gave up and weeds took over, knees drawn up, too thin in a shirt that had once been Dudley's, and still carried the blunt memory of larger elbows. His dark hair refused all discipline. His glasses had slid down his nose. Across his brow, half hidden under untidy fringe, the scar lay pale in the evening. He was not crying. Harry almost never cried in the moments Dumbledore witnessed, which troubled him more than tears would have done. Children who cry still expect response. The boy held something in his hands. At first, Dumbledore thought it a toy filched from Dudley's room and rescued into solitude. Then he saw it was a dead dandelion gone to seed, and Harry was blowing at it one careful breath at a time, releasing the white parachutes into the warm air as though they were worth the concentration. Petunia crossed the kitchen window behind him carrying a dish. She did not look out. Vernon's bulk appeared briefly in the doorway, bellowed something inaudible through the glass, and vanished again. Harry's shoulders tightened, then relaxed by effort. He bent and resumed dismantling the dandelion. Dumbledore felt, not for the first time, the sour temptation to interfere directly. He could knock. He could speak with all the authority age and power had placed at his disposal. He could alter the household's behavior by fear, if not by kindness. He had chosen not to, year after year, because fear is a poor tutor, and because the protection woven through Petunia's reluctant guardianship depended on conditions subtler than obedience. Yet, theory sits far more comfortably in a headmaster's office than in a lane where a boy in his care blows apart a weed to amuse himself. Harry looked up suddenly, as if sensing something. Dumbledore stilled. The wards around the property brushed his awareness in soft golden strands, answering his presence but not admitting it. The boy's face turned toward the far hedge. For one heartbeat, his expression was so direct, so open to the world despite everything, that Dumbledore had the absurd fear Harry might see him there among the shadows and waves. Instead, Harry frowned and rubbed at his scar. A pulse of cold moved through the wards. Dumbledore's own hand tightened on his wand. It was not pain exactly that he felt from the scar, more like resonance. The same doubled vibration he had touched on the doorstep years ago. The same black recoil he had detected in the nursery ruins and above the hidden stone in the Gaunt Shack. Time and research had made his recognition more exact. What on Privet Drive had once seemed unnameable now rose before him with appalling clarity. He drew the wand a fraction and performed the smallest diagnostic charm he knew, a filament of silver fine enough to travel the wards without disturbing them. It brushed the boundary, slipped like moonlight across the grass, and touched the air above Harry's brow. The response was immediate. For a heartbeat, the scar shone not red or gold, but with a darkened silver, as if the filament had met something beneath the skin that devoured brightness before yielding it back altered. The boy flinched, put a hand to his head, and glanced around in bewilderment. Then the effect vanished. The evening returned. Inside the house, a door slammed. Somewhere, a lawn sprinkler began to hiss. Dumbledore lowered his wand. There are realizations that arrive like lightning, dramatic and clean. This was not one of them. It came instead with the sick, inexorable settling of a truth, long circling the edges of thought. The child had survived not only because Lily's love had shielded him, but because when the curse rebounded and tore its caster apart, a fragment of Tom's ravaged soul had latched onto the only living thing left in reach. Harry had become, without choice and without understanding, an accidental vessel, the last and worst of all possible cruelties. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Harry was still sitting in the weeds, looking mildly annoyed by his own inexplicable headache. A child. Still only that. Dumbledore forced himself to see the boy rather than the horror attached to him. Harry's capacity for patience. The way he shared sweets with Fig's nastiest cat because he could not bear to watch any hungry creature alone. The reports from primary school of unreasonable courage in fights not his own. The untidy, stubborn kindness that kept surviving conditions designed to stunt it. None of that belonged to Tom. Evil does not ennoble by proximity. It parasitizes. Harry's goodness existed in spite of the fragment, not because of it. That distinction mattered more than any theory of soul magic. A movement at the end of the street drew his eye. Arabella Fig, bent and drab and perfect in her resemblance to harmless irrelevance, had stepped outside her gate with a bowl in one hand and 3 cats winding around her ankles. She did not look toward Dumbledore, but the angle of her shoulders conveyed readiness. If Harry cried out or if the wards shifted dangerously, she would intervene in whatever bumbling civilian manner the Dursleys found sufficiently tedious to permit. She had helped save the boy in small, unheroic ways for years. Dumbledore felt a rush of gratitude, almost enough to be grief. He withdrew deeper into shadow and remained there until Harry was called inside. The boy rose at once, not with the sluggish entitlement of Dudley, but with the alertness of the chronically unwelcome. He brushed grass from his knees, cast one last look at the dandelion stem in his hand, and went in through the back door. Petunia shut it behind him with a sharp motion that needed no sound. Only then did Dumbledore allow himself to apparate. He reappeared in the headmaster's office and stood for several seconds without removing his cloak. Fawkes, sensing distress, lifted his head and gave a low, resonant note. The silver instruments on the desk turned idly in their usual circuits, absurdly peaceful. Dumbledore crossed to the window and looked out over the dark grounds. Somewhere below, unseen in the forest fringe, creatures went about their lives with the simple integrity of appetite and sleep. In the astronomy tower, an owl shifted. The castle waited as castles do, believing itself durable enough to outlast the griefs of men. Harry was a Horcrux. The sentence had the brute indecency of a slur. Dumbledore could barely permit it in thought. A Horcrux. Not because he had sought power, not because he had committed murder, not because he had chosen anything at all, but because a monster had failed to die cleanly, and a mother had loved too completely. He sat at last, drew parchment toward him, and did not write for several minutes. When he did, the words were slow. Harry carries a fragment, not himself, attached. No action possible without risk to the child. He set down the quill and stared at the lines until they blurred. All his calculations altered then. The hunt was no longer only an effort to prevent Tom's return. It was a race against the day Harry would come to Hogwarts carrying an enemy under his own skin. Every year that passed without resolution increased the chance of contact, influence, possession, reciprocal recognition. Tom, restored to strength, might sense the fragment instantly. Harry, already connected through scar and survival, might become bridge, beacon, vulnerability. The boy must be protected from knowledge until knowledge could help rather than wound. But ignorance could not remain the plan forever. Dumbledore felt the old, despised machinery of necessity begin to turn, and with it the equally old awareness that necessity in his life had too often demanded a child pay some portion of the cost. "No," he said aloud into the empty office. Fawkes answered with another low note. "No," Dumbledore repeated more firmly. "Not as before. It was a promise to no one, and therefore possibly the most sincere kind. He would not allow Harry to become merely the final battlefield. He would not pace patiently toward the sacrifice of a boy, because prophecy and dark magic had arranged a cruel geometry. If there was a way to separate fragment from host and spare the child, he would find it. If there was no known way, he would make one, or die looking. Outside, the summer dark thickened over the school. Inside, an old man sat with the knowledge that the enemy he had begun to hunt in relics and ruins had already, for years, been sleeping in a cupboard on Privet Drive. On the last night before Harry Potter's first Hogwarts letter was sent, thunder walked around the castle like a patient judge. Rain struck the office windows in hard diagonal lines. The lake below flashed intermittently under white seams of lightning, then vanished again into black. Every candle in the room seemed to lean from its own flame as if listening. Fawkes, outlined in red gold against the dimness, watched from the perch without sleep. It had become one of those nights in which decision felt less like choosing, and more like finally admitting what one had already become responsible for. Dumbledore's desk had long since surrendered any appearance of ordinary scholarly order. Maps lay half unrolled over one another, pins and annotations turning Britain into a topography of dread. Memories in glass vials caught the lamplight. There were sketches of the Gaunt Ring, transcriptions from Burke's ledgers, notes on Hepzibah Smith's death, and on the Lestrange line into which certain treasures might later vanish, if not intercepted. A separate sheaf contained references to the Room of Hidden Things within Hogwarts, and every surviving rumor about relics associated with Ravenclaw. Another recorded mentions of a diary Tom had carried in school, black and private and handled, according to more than one classmate, with greater tenderness than he ever showed living company. Elsewhere lay an unfinished list of Voldemort's known or suspected refuges between school and first rise to power. Albania, certain old manors, caves, the memories of followers, the secrets of the castle. At the center of it all sat the shortest note, and the one Dumbledore hated most. Harry. He had spent the preceding years doing what he did best and what he mistrusted most, thinking. He had thought in circles and in lattice work, in moral arguments and practical sequences, in contingencies branching from contingencies until dawn found him staring at the same 3 lines from 3 separate angles. He had read. He had corresponded discreetly with Nicolas, with obscure scholars of enchantment, with one goblin metallurgist who despised dark magic only slightly less than he despised wizards, and was therefore usefully candid about goblin-made blades. He had watched Lucius Malfoy without ever once betraying the attention, because arrogance can be patient when wealth insulates it, and Malfoy had inherited from his old circle not merely influence, but perhaps custody. He had waited for certain imprisoned fanatics to break under Azkaban into speech, and found that Bellatrix Lestrange would scream devotion forever, but explain nothing. He had questioned house elves, old servants, former classmates, collectors of cursed antiquities, and the last surviving purveyors of wartime vanities. He had gone back to places that stank of Tom's self-regard until even his own dreams had begun to organize themselves like inventory. The shape now was clearer than he wanted it to be. The ring remained in the Gaunt Shack, warded by his own concealments until he could remove and destroy it safely. The locket had passed from Hepzibah Smith into Tom's hands and from Tom, almost certainly, into some hiding place chosen for private significance. Regulus Black's disappearance years later might mean something about the Dark Lord's trust and distrust within old houses, though the trail there remained fog. The cup, stolen the same night as the locket, had likely been placed where blood purity and vault work met. A relic of Ravenclaw's, if Tom had acquired one, would almost certainly be hidden at Hogwarts or tied to the school in some intimate, theatrical way. The diary, if it was what Dumbledore increasingly suspected, might be less a mere relic than a preservation of self from the period Tom considered his purest descent. Nagini remained only a question in the margins. Tom had always liked serpents too much for comfort. A living vessel was possible in theory, though more unstable. And Harry. Harry was the accidental remainder, the unasked-for anchor left by catastrophe. Dumbledore rose and crossed to the cabinet where the black volume on Horcruxes had been locked these several years. He removed it, opened it to the pages he knew too well, and read once more the passages on destruction. The text was maddening in its brevity. A Horcrux could not be undone by ordinary damage, nor by the common severing of enchantment. The containing vessel had to be irreparably broken beyond magical repair by means destructive enough to overwhelm the Horcrux protections. Venom of singular lethality. Fiend fire. Rare, catastrophic magics. He closed the book again. The problem of method had once seemed an obstacle. He no longer saw it that way. One finds tools when the target is known. Delay disguised as prudence had already been allowed too many years. He returned to the desk and looked at Harry's name. The boy would receive his letter tomorrow. He would leave Privet Drive soon and come under the gaze of the castle, the professors, the ghosts, the portraits, the old rooms that had shaped Tom and might recognize him by the fragment he carried. Dumbledore had imagined years before that he might need more time, more evidence, more certainty. Age teaches some people patience. It teaches others the cost of mistaking hesitation for wisdom. There would be no more waiting. He sat and began to write instructions. One to Minerva, seemingly routine, regarding the first-year intake and a particular need for discretion surrounding Harry's arrival. One to a confidential contact in Gringotts, requesting a social meeting about certain goblin properties of imbued metals. and the destruction of cursed artifacts. One to Arabella, thanking her more warmly than he had ever permitted himself in writing and advising continued vigilance during the final days before school. One to Severus, summoning him not for remorse or memories now but for action. Dumbledore required everything the former Death Eater could tell him about Lucius Malfoy's private habits, old gifts from the Dark Lord, odd heirlooms in circulation, and names Tom had ever spoken with proprietary emphasis. 1. Unsigned, to be delivered indirectly into circles where old pure-blood gossip still traveled, baiting curiosity about an appraisal of rare founder-associated objects. Vanity sometimes flushed prey more efficiently than force. He wrote until his hand cramped. Thunder passed over the tower and away again. At length he pushed back from the desk and went to the window. Rain streamed down the glass in silvery ropes. Beyond it, the ground swam in stormlight and shadow. Somewhere below, first year's boats would cross in a few weeks, lanterns bobbing like fallen stars. Harry would look up at the castle and see wonder. He deserved, Dumbledore thought with sudden violence, to have that wonder uncontaminated by the rot an older generation had failed to scour from the world in time. Behind him, Fawkes sang. The song was soft at first, almost beneath hearing, then rose into the room's high dark spaces with that impossible phoenix quality of containing grief and endurance, without allowing either to triumph fully. Dumbledore closed his eyes and let it move through him. There had been years in his life when music like that would have sent him toward memory and paralysis. Tonight, it steadied him. He turned back to the desk, drew a clean sheet of parchment toward him and wrote at the top, Tom Riddle, Horcrux Hunt. Beneath it, in a hand so controlled it was nearly severe, he listed every known and suspected vessel. Next to each he wrote the strategy, however provisional. Inquiry, surveillance, retrieval, destruction, unknown method to be resolved, unknown location to be forced into light. He wrote until the page filled, and then began another. The act itself was clarifying. Horror dispersed into tasks. Tasks could be attempted. When he finished, he laid the quill aside and looked at what he had made. This was the secret war, then. Not against armies or ministries or public fear, but against fragments. Against one man's refusal to accept limits. Against old blood and old vanity and dark objects hidden like rot in the beams of the world. It would require lies perhaps and silences certainly. It would require trust in people he wished he did not need and caution in places he wished to burn clean in one righteous burst. It would require descending into the biography of a monster and dismantling, piece by piece, the altars at which that monster had worshipped himself. So be it. Dumbledore gathered the scattered notes into ordered piles. He sealed the list of Horcruxes behind 3 locks and a blood-keyed charm of his own design. He extinguished every candle but one. The office drew inward around the final pool of light until desk and old wizard and phoenix seemed the whole of the world's remaining intention. Then, very quietly, because some vows are strongest when made without audience, he spoke into the storm-dark room. Before the boy belongs to this castle, he said, you will have nowhere left to hide. Lightning flashed. For an instant, the windows turned white. In that brief brilliance, his face looked carved from age, sorrow, and a still dangerous will. When the dark returned, he was already moving. He took up his traveling cloak. He tucked the first dossier inside it. He lifted the lamp from the desk, though he had no need of mundane light, because there are journeys on which one carries a lamp less to see than to declare oneself unwilling to proceed blind. Fawkes spread scarlet wings and, with a rustle like pages turning, rose from the perch to follow. Below, the castle slept. Above, thunder rolled toward the mountains. And in the office that had witnessed so many plans, so many failures, so many choices deferred until they hardened into destiny, Albus Dumbledore went out to begin the work that should have begun the night a child was left on a doorstep under a dark suburban sky.